All right, welcome everybody to the real world evidence webinar for diverse clinical evidence needs. Um, Quick introduction on my end. I'm Kyle Howes. I'll be your host today. I'm the Director of Business Development here at 3Aware. It's my pleasure to host today's session. So for those of you attending that are new to 3Aware, really what we're doing is we are revolutionizing how medtech companies generate real world clinical evidence. So our platform integrates directly with health systems and provides full access to de-identified, easily digestible patient EHR records. So this includes unstructured EHR clinical notes and provides a comprehensive longitudinal view of the patient journey for a wide variety of use cases. These use cases include PMCF, indication-specific data, longitudinal data needs for post-market surveillance, label expansion, validation studies, comparator studies, and more. So this unique approach not only accelerates study timelines, but bridges the gap between clinical research and everyday patient care. So we're trying to offer a deeper understanding of how your devices perform in everyday use. Now, I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker and host today, Amelia Hufford. So Amelia is the co-founder and senior vice president of clinical and regulatory science at 3Aware. She has over a decade of expertise in regulatory and clinical affairs, having held leadership roles at Cook Medical. She's also a dedicated scientist holding a PhD in microbiology and was recently named Life Science Voice's Rising Stars Award for 2024, recognizing her driving a significant transformation across the medtech space. Amelia is not only a leader in the medtech field, but also a thought leader in the space, and we're very fortunate to have her with us today to share her insights. As Amelia presents, please utilize the chat as well as the Q&A section for any questions or topics you'd like us to touch on during the Q&A section at the end. We look forward to answering those. Amelia, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for the great introduction. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm going to walk us through a little bit of introductory information on real-world evidence. And then I want to get right into several interesting test cases that we're involved in and are currently utilizing real-world evidence. So I like to start off these discussions just with a quick definition of what real-world data and what real-world evidence is. And I utilize the US FDA's definition for real-world data and real-world evidence. Basically, real-world data is any data relating to a patient's health status that is collected during routine care. So this can come from a multitude of sources. Probably some of the most common sources are electronic health record data, device or disease registries, but also medical claims data. So utilizing the ICD-10, ICD-9 codes, hospital procedure codes, CPT codes, those are also common sources of real-world data. Real-world data can also include patient-generated data. So for instance, data collected from wearables, such as your Apple Watch. That is also considered real-world data. And then again, data from active surveillance systems as well. Real-world evidence, however, is taking the data and analyzing the data and then assessing the potential benefits or risks of the medical product of interest derived from the analysis of data. So the data is the source of the information, and the real-world evidence is the analyzed assessment of risks and benefits. So next, I want to start off with why bother with real-world evidence or real-world data. I think there's a lot of information as to sources and what it can be, but I think there's also a lot of questions and perhaps misconceptions or just a feeling of not where to to find information on how to use real world data and real world evidence. After we go through that, I want to discuss a few case studies. We have one particular case study where real world evidence was used to successfully meet PMCF obligations. We have another case study where real world evidence is currently being used for EU market access. And then finally, another case study where real world evidence, in particular, the real world data from the unstructured notes of electronic health records are being used to help validate a code model algorithm. And I'm just going to pause. Apologies. I know 'tis the season for laryngitis and bronchitis. I'm going to be sipping on some hot water and tea. So if you see me do that throughout the course of the webinar, apologies in advance. So why bother with real world data, real world evidence? Well, traditional studies are narrow in scope by design. The RCTs, the gold standards, are narrow in order to control sources of error and bias. However, these may lead to a very narrow scope where insights can be drawn from the data. Real world data studies, however, because they're more heterogeneous, they're gathering data for more heterogeneous populations, they may actually provide more accurate insights in how products behave in larger populations. So heterogeneity, again, is often seen as a limitation of real world data. But if you're thinking about the context of representation, rural data can provide actually a more comprehensive understanding of how a medical product performs in clinical practice when you're not, working with just a handful of highly trained sites enrolling, patients with heavy inclusion and exclusion criteria. Doing this, though, does require monitoring the selection bias. And there's more information about that in some of the draft guidances that are available and we'll talk about after a bit. Traditional clinical studies also may be impractical or unethical to conduct. For example, in the case of assigning treatment assignments, or in the cases of rare diseases, or in certain populations, and also in the cases of long-term follow-up. For example, if you're wanting to collect data on a permanent implant and you are asked to be able to collect 10-year follow-up, that is very hard and sometimes impractical to collect in a traditional clinical study setting. Rural data may allow for the assessment of longer-term outcomes. So as I mentioned, it may be impractical to have a study that collects 10-year follow-up. But if you are gathering data that is collected as part of routine care, it can actually serve as a practical method to assess that device and safety and performance over the expected lifetime. There's no additional burden to the patient, to the site, to the study sponsor, and holding such a long-term study when you're utilizing real-world data. Also, traditional clinical studies can be time and resource intensive, and so real-world evidence can provide a sustainable approach both in cost and in the FTE resources required to conduct a study, especially a long-term study. Real-world evidence can expedite both regulatory decision-making and identification of safety signals, both short and long-term. This is true in cases where you can retrospectively look at the data, look back in time and see, this patient perhaps had such an outcome, that occurred 30, 60, 90 days following the procedure or exposure to the device. Whereas if you were running a prospective study, those you would identify those signals in real time. Also, real-world data can inform device benefit risk profiles from real-world environments. Again, most of medicine does not occur within centers of excellence and highly trained sites. There's a lot of data that can be gathered from more rural health systems and sites, and that information is important to collect and inform on the benefit risk profile for patients. And finally, because there's such a a bolus of data, because this data does exist, manufacturers may actually be required to justify not considering real-world data as part of their clinical evaluation. So, taking into account the reasons why you might want to utilize real-world data in your clinical strategy, how can this data be assessed and the evidence that is generated from the data support regulatory submissions? Per US regulation, I've noted here, it states, although a manufacturer may submit any form of evidence to FDA in attempt to substantiate the safety and effectiveness of a device, the agency relies upon only valid scientific evidence to determine whether there is reasonable assurance that the device is safe and effective. So, can real-world evidence constitute valid scientific evidence? Currently, there is FDA guidance that states data derived from real-world sources can be used to support regulatory decisions, and real-world evidence may constitute valid scientific evidence depending on the characteristics of the data, the study question, the design, and the analysis of the data. It's important to consider there is no one-size-fits-all approach to real-world data studies and to clinical studies in general. So you have to consider the source, you have to consider the scientific questions you're asking, and you have to consider the characteristics of the data to determine whether or not it constitutes as valid scientific evidence. Real-world data has been shown to support uses across the medical device total product life cycle if it is considered valid scientific evidence. And some examples of those are listed here, including, importantly, including generating primary clinical evidence to support marketing authorization. In addition, real-world evidence can be used directly to provide new information on safety and effectiveness that can help in the research and development process for next generation products. It can be used to generate evidence for label expansion. And this, again, can be done via off-label usage of usage of the device. If you can gather safety and performance data, and the data is fit for purpose to ask and to answer rather the scientific questions, it can be used to help update the labeling for those products. Also, it's been shown that there's a lot of evidence from a post-market surveillance perspective that comes from real-world data. And again, the pivotal studies, the pre-market studies alone may not identify every signal, safety signal, performance signal that occurs, and having a robust post-market surveillance program that includes real-world data can help identify some of those unknowns. And finally, providing post-market data in lieu of some pre-market data. So perhaps you will be able to get market access with a certain amount of follow-up data, and then you can collect additional follow-up data as part of your post-market clinical follow-up program in order to continue evidence collection on your product. So um, that's a lot of examples and information from the U.S. perspective. However, real-world evidence can also constitute valid scientific evidence in Europe as well, and we get this question a lot. One thing that is important to consider is that the European Medical Device Regulation allows for the use of multiple clinical data sources if scientifically valid methodologies used to generate the clinical data are reliable and robust. There's no direct mention of real-world data in the regulation. However, this is an area that is right now it's undergoing a lot of focus. And I think 3Aware and others are going to, in 2025 especially, we're going to be following this view of real world data in Europe and how it's changes and how we're going to get more information over time. In the meantime, there are some direct references to real world data in MDCG guidances. So for example, MDCG 2020-6 states that indirect clinical benefits may be demonstrable by other evidence, such as real world data. And MDCG 2020-7, which is the template for PMCF plans, they reference that real-world evidence analyses can be a type of PMCF strategy, and the real-world data from which these analyses are based on, however, should be of sufficient quality and come from reliable data sources. So here's the question. Real-world data can constitute scientifically valid evidence if they come from reliable data sources and are of sufficient quality. But what constitutes sufficient quality and what constitutes data that is reliable? Where does one go for that information? This is an interesting time, I think, for real-world data, because I think when it comes to a framework that outlines expectations for quality and methods, FDA is perhaps the most advanced, thanks in part to the passage of two laws. The first is the 21st Century Cures Act from 2017, and the second is the FDORA that was passed in 2022. There's been guidances focused, FDA has passed guidances focused specifically on medical devices and FDA. And they've established actually a public-private partnership via NEST CC, which has pioneered some frameworks that have recently been incorporated into a draft guidance. So again, I always look to FDA's guidances, but by no means are those the only guidances available. Health authorities globally have issued guidances. For instance, I think in Health Canada, there's a 2022 guidance that states various types of post-market data may be included to support product safety and effectiveness and new licenses applications. They basically state that for medical devices, manufacturers should follow the methods and quality parameters set out in a 2019 guidance for drugs. But they're, I think, working on establishing medical device specific guidances as well. Also, Japan's PMDA, they've introduced legislative reform promoting real-world data utilization and also several guidelines. And I think in 2021, PMDA established a real-world data working group that is going to put together frameworks and discuss regulatory issues regarding real-world data and real-world evidence standards, methods, approaches to promote the utilization of real-world data in Japan. And finally, China is actually really interesting. So China's NMPA, which is their formerly it was their CFDA, their Chinese FDA. They've issued guidance on utilizing real-world data to support clinical evaluation of medical devices. And the Chinese government has allowed qualified real-world data collected in a specific region of China to support registration applications on devices meeting urgent and unmet needs. So in this particular region of China, patients can travel to and be treated with products, and then rural data collected within that region can then be used for regulatory submissions. So all of this to say, I think it's clear that utilizing real-world evidence is a worldwide movement, and it's not a new movement. This has been happening for a long time in the pharmaceutical space, but it's gathering steam with medical devices. So briefly, I just show here, I mentioned the draft guidance from FDA. I highly recommend if you're considering real-world data strategies in your clinical program, I highly recommend looking at this draft guidance. I think currently it's still in draft. The final guidance is from 2017, but since then, this draft guidance that was released last, I think almost exactly a year ago, it's greatly expanded information on data relevance, reliability, and methodologies for the collection of real-world evidence. This actually has information on a fit-for-purpose assessment, and then they provide examples on study protocols and study reports, so you can see what the expectations might be for running a real-world study and what the protocols and reports should contain. They also have a checklist for recommended elements to include in regulatory documentation. And then finally, there's actually an entire guidance on examples of how real-world evidence has been successfully used, but Appendix B of this draft guidance has some more updated examples. So if you're looking if you're looking for where to start from a methods perspective, please refer to this guidance. And also, I think we're going to have some guidance coming from OUS as well. Europe is investing some focus in this area. They're establishing the integration of heterogeneous data and evidence towards regulatory and HTA acceptance. So they've put together a group called IDERA. It's also a public-private partnership, which is funded by EU's Innovative Health Initiative. It's taking best practices and guidances developed by US FDA and NEST to advance the development of medical device regulatory frameworks for real-world evidence Europe. So similar to NEST, we're hoping that this initiative might lead to guidances and expectations for real-world data and real-world evidence in Europe as well. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about case studies. And this first case study, it's an example of how real-world data was used successfully to meet PMCF needs. At the end of my presentation, I've got a link, and I believe the slides are going to be shared with everyone following this meeting, but there's a link to our 3Ware blog post about this case study. And from there, you can actually download the case study and get more information if you're interested. So in this case, the study sponsors were utilizing electronic health record data in an analytic platform to meet PMCF needs. And the study sponsors had three non-negotiables. The first was that they must be able to link patients to a specific catalog number. And the reason for this was that this PMCF project was specific to a next generation device, and that device had the same name as the predecessor. So in order to distinguish data collected on the older version of the device versus the newer version of the device, they had to be able to connect the catalog number to the patient and the procedure in which it was used. In addition, this study required being able to follow patients, not just collect data at the time of procedure, but also follow those patients for 30 days after the procedure to assess their safety and performance outcomes. And then finally, this device was pretty interesting in that it had 6 distinct intended purposes. And the patient cohort required collecting patients on each of those cohorts. In particular, there are 3 less common uses, and they needed to make sure they were collecting data on patients that had those indications as well. And just to show you what those are, here's a list of this device and each of the approved uses of this device. So it can be used in endoscopic marking. It can be used for hemostasis. It can be used for prophylactic clipping, especially following a procedure such as a polypectomy, which can occur during colonoscopies. It can be used to anchor. So it can anchor feeding tubes, jejunal feeding tubes to the wall of the small bowel. And it can be used as a supplementary method to close perforations, small perforations less than 20 millimeters. And finally, it can be used to affix and anchor fully covered esophageal self-expanding metal stents to the wall of the esophagus. So there were three indications here that are bolded. And these are the indications that were rare and harder to find. So we needed to make sure we captured these patients who had undergone these uses in our cohort. So a little bit of information about this study. The study requirements were prospectively defined and assessed against the real-world data source. So before we even got started, we were able to identify patients who met the criteria in that they were treated with the device. We were able to follow them for 30 days post-procedure, and we were able to see the indications. There were some required data elements as part of this study. We needed to be able to identify demographics and relevant patient medical history, as well as the anatomic location of clip deployment. So this goes back to the what was stated earlier about data source and the scientific questions you're asking. If you need to know, where a clip was deployed and how many clips were used, and if they were used as adjunctive or combination treatments, you wouldn't be able to gather that information from some of the available real-world data sources like medical claims data. To answer those scientific questions, you would need to have access to EHR data and specifically unstructured data, such as the operative notes, the clinical notes. Those are where you're going to find information such as location and what other treatments were done in combination with that particular target anatomy. Also, the manufacturer needed to be able to identify if there was any device malfunction or use error that occurred during the procedure, and whether or not there was success of delivery and deployment of the clip. So they needed to be able to understand, was there any misdeployment, any kinking, any issue with the device that might have led to failure of the deployment to the target anatomy. And then obviously they needed to be able to collect data to assess the safety and performance measures, which each separate indication had a separate definition of clinical success and safety, as you might imagine. So, for example, endoscopic marking, the definition for success for that indication was that the clip was retained at the target location for the necessary amount of time. However, if you're thinking hemostasis, if that's the indication, then clinical success is defined as initial hemostasis. And the same is true, again, for the various indications. Anchoring of the feeding tube, clinical success would be defined as the lack of migration of that feeding tube. But if you're thinking, if the patient was treated with the hemoclip to close a perforation, then success would be defined as closure of that perforation. And so again, we had to be able to identify the indication, and we had to be able to identify data within the unstructured notes that allowed us to determine success and safety. So if you, again, if you want more information on this case study, please go to our link in the blog, 3Ware blog that has a link to that case study. But I'll summarize here that the PMCF objectives were successfully met with reduced time and effort. Before commencing, the study team was confident that the cohort included the uncommon indications. And one thing that I'll note is if we were looking at just the diagnoses and procedure codes alone, that would have resulted in misidentification of indications. With medical devices, especially, devices such as a hemoclip, there's typically not a specific procedure code. It's a very, very general procedure code. And so when you're talking about patients who have, a lot of comorbidities, they're undergoing a lot within their GI tract. There was one patient in particular that did have bleeding, GI bleeding and happening. But actually, the clip was used as an endoscopic marker to note the location of a concerning lesion. So if we were just looking at the codes, we may have misidentified the indication for hemostasis when in fact it was used for endoscopic marking. Also, the study sponsor uncovered adverse events and performance failures that were in line with the same rates that they were expecting from the state of the art. I think it's not uncommon, and we've seen this. I've seen this personally, where we will collect data through various sources, and we see rates of adverse events and performance failures that are lower than what we expected. There could be various reasons for that. And in a lot of cases, especially with retrospective chart reviews, it may be hard for the reviewer to connect adverse events that happen later to that procedure with that device of interest. So with the ability to have all of that information available in a very structured, intuitive way, the study sponsors were able to uncover adverse events in the study, whereas in the previous study, they had a very, very low, if not zero, detection of adverse events. So that shows that this particular strategy is very sensitive in collecting any outcome data as they occur. Also, importantly, the study sponsor was able to complete this PMCF project within 6 months, which is less than half of the typical retrospective chart review timelines. I think we've seen anywhere from 12 to 18 months, depending on how fast you're able to find sites who are willing to participate, and how fast you're able to work through the budgeting and contracting with those individual sites. Completing a study from start to finish and within 6 months was pretty exciting for this team. And then finally, no deficiencies regarding this PMCF study from the notified body. So again, it successfully met their PMCF requirements, and did so with reduced time and effort. So I'm going to switch gears, and I'm going to present another case study that we're currently working on. In this case study, it's a combination of EU market access and PMCF. So this particular project we're working on is it's an orthopedic device. It's a knee replacement device. And the requirements for this project is to collect multi-year follow-up data to help bridge some clinical evidence gaps in order to meet their EU needs. So just a little bit of information. This device system was 510(k) cleared in the US, and is used in the US for total knee arthroplasty. So it's been available on the US market for several years. However, in the EU, in particular under EU MDR, it is a class 3 implant. So the manufacturer and of this device, they did conduct a pivotal study which included 5-year follow-up. However, almost half of the patient sample, 46% specifically, withdrew early or were lost to follow-up before that 5-year visit. In order to gain EU market access, the manufacturer needed to have a strategy to collect 10-year follow-up. And also, importantly, one of the requirements was that they also needed to collect patient-reported outcome measure data. And just a little bit of information about patient-reported outcome measure data, or PROM data. PROMs are increasingly recognized by regulators as valuable mechanisms in order to collect patient-focused data. I think we're going to see this expectation increase across the regulatory authorities. And in fact, recent FDA guidance has stated that patient-reported outcome measures facilitate the systematic collection of how patients feel, function, and survive as valid scientific evidence to support the regulatory and healthcare decision-making process. And by integrating patients' voices throughout the total product lifecycle, concepts important to patients can be considered in the evaluation and surveillance of medical devices. So when you think about real-world data sources, and you think about the expectation to have patient-reported outcome measures as part of your clinical evidence, I think you might be considering, are these even available within real-world data sources? And interestingly, the patient voice is not just valuable to regulators, it's also valuable to hospitals and payers as well. So when we're looking at arthroplasty, for example, there's actually increasing pressures for these practices to incorporate the collection of patient-reported outcome measures into standard care. CMS in the US and private payers offer financial incentives to practices that collect and report on patient-reported outcome measures in their bundle payment programs. And if pursuing a Joint Commission or disease-specific care certification, PROMs are an important part of the quality data set that sites need to collect. And in fact, hospitals are now requiring collecting and reporting patient-reported outcome measures as part of their hospital inpatient quality reporting program. And that was set as of this year. So one thing that we naturally asked was that, okay, for this particular study looking at the total knee replacement devices, are patient-reported outcome measures that speak to the patient voice in these types of procedures? Are those being routinely collected in medical practice? And what we identified was that one of the most common and recognized PROMs for knee replacement, the knee injury and osteoarthritis outcome score, also known as the KOOS-JR survey, that PROM is routinely captured in standard practice, both pre-procedure, post-procedure, as well as annually thereafter. And what we found in our data set was that we currently have patients who were treated over 4 years ago who have an annual survey, KOOS-JR survey completed. So for this particular case study, the study team is going to assess patients that have 3+ years data and then follow them annually until their 10th year. So in this way, we'll be able to collect longer term data, 5+ years, hopefully to 10 years on individual patients. And again, we're hoping to see less loss to follow-up due to the fact that there's no additional burden on the patient or the site other than what's part of their routine care. So finally, I'm going to switch gears again, and I'm going to talk about another really interesting case study that we're seeing with some of our clients. And this one, I think in particular, I'm pretty excited about. It's basically utilizing the information that's captured in the unstructured notes to validate models that our client has put together. So healthcare economics and outcomes research teams are developing models to predict adverse patient outcomes utilizing a pattern of codes and procedure types. So we're working with teams that can, based on the procedure that is performed, and then the codes that are collected, they can identify whether or not a patient has experienced an adverse outcome. And again, it's based on a procedure and then the presence or absence of a particular diagnosis code. This model, however, requires the validation from regulatory authorities, and really the most direct approach to validate the model would be to assess the unstructured data from those patients who meet the criteria of having experienced that adverse outcome, and then look for reference of that adverse outcome in the unstructured data. The connection between structured and unstructured data is really uncommon, especially when you're talking about databases that have hundreds of thousands of medical claims data, codes data. Connecting those to the unstructured data is not common. It's near impossible. So utilizing a real-world data source where you can see both the codes and the operative notes, the follow-up notes, the progress notes, that connection will be utilized again to validate whether or not their model is sensitive in assessing those adverse patient outcomes. So this is definitely a study that I hope we are going to also have a case study available, and more information to come hopefully next year on this case. So just to close, I want to say we presented 3 case studies here today, but there are many examples of how real-world evidence can benefit the clinical evidence needs of med tech. We briefly talked about it, but right now, especially within the US and the NEST Mark program with FDA, label expansion is a focus. for real world data. In addition, I think folks are already using real world data as control groups, historically matched control groups, especially when assigning a control group is not possible. And then finally, you can utilize similar device data. So you can gather data on devices from, the same product code and collect data on those to help establish benchmarks, which can be used for new products on the market. All of this, though, again, it's important to go back to how to utilize this data, how to constitute it as scientifically valid. And for that, you have to consider the source, you have to consider the scientific questions, you have to consider the reliability and relevance of the data. And I think we're going to have more and more guidances, more and more information to help with that. But again, in the meantime, I just always chime in and say, go look at the current draft guidance that FDA has. And hopefully that will be finalized soon. So I will go ahead and turn it back over to my colleague Kyle. But before I do, please feel free to reach out to us. I think we have Kyle's contact information here. And then there's a link to the case study, again, that I mentioned that you can download. So thanks everyone for your time. And Kyle, I will turn it over while I have a sip of water here.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. This was fantastic. Your expertise is amazing, and I hope this has given our attendees some valuable insight into how 3Aware is revolutionizing the clinical evidence generation space for medtech. We got 9 minutes left, so I think we'll utilize this to discuss any questions the audience may have. So if you guys have any questions, please utilize the Q&A section, type it in there, and we can touch on those topics. But I guess to kick things off, Amelia, today we talked through, some PMCF endoscopic use case, a knee replacement use case for longitudinal data for new CE mark and post-market surveillance, as well as the label expansion. Are you seeing any other use cases where teams can utilize real-world evidence on top of the validation studies as well?
Yeah, I think we're going to get more and more. I think I showed just briefly one that I haven't yet been a part of, but I think would be very interesting, and we might have an opportunity to do this, is to collect data on similar devices. So again, if you're working on a new product and you're wanting to establish acceptance criteria, for example, for safety and performance elements, collecting that data on similar type products would be really, it depends on where you get the data, obviously, and the cost, but that would be a great way to help establish that those benchmarks for users. I think we'll also see, I talked about control groups. I think patient-reported outcome measures is one that we're kind of talking about meeting regulatory needs, but also if we're needing to also consider meeting payer needs, reimbursement needs. The study designs are similar, but there's often different data elements. The real-world data source, again, is a great tool and source for meeting those needs as well.
That's great. And I think most people on this call have probably have some experience with unstructured data or epic data, right? I think we all know that it can be difficult to digest that data. How does 3Aware's platform help digest this information? And are there any common challenges companies face when working with structured notes?
Yeah, yeah. Great question. And I've thought about this from the site's perspective. I've worked with sites where, we've asked them to collect 12 months follow-up. And what they're doing is they're logging in, right, to Epic, and they're looking at a patient. And the ability to follow that patient through every encounter that they've had for 12 months and help, to identify any possible adverse event or issue with the device, I think would be very hard, if the data isn't organized around the index procedure. So one way that 3Aware helps to make this possible is that all of the data is centered around your device of interest, the procedure in which the device first encountered the patient, and then you can, from a chronological standpoint, see every encounter that occurred within your follow-up period after that index procedure. So it's all very intuitively organized, chronologically organized. But in addition, right, you still have to read those notes. So another way that the platform helps to make that possible is that it can prioritize which notes might have reference to an adverse event or performance issue via our keyword function. So you can include all of the known adverse events. We're actually working to establish a more automated approach utilizing medical dictionaries that can help flag adverse outcomes. That'll be an offering, hopefully, that we'll have soon. But in the meantime, any note that has reference to that keyword will be flagged, so you can direct your focus to that. So yeah, I think that's the trade-off with having such depth of data, is you have a lot of data. So you need to be able to have an intuitive platform and efficiencies built in to help make sure you don't miss anything within any signals within that data.
That's great. Yeah. So it sounds like ThreeWare, makes the data digestible to the non-technical or non-scientific user through keyword functionality,
Yeah.
flagging those notes that need to be reviewed, which brings up another good question around study requirements and what those keywords are. How flexible is ThreeWare when it comes to tailoring studies to meet medtech manufacturers' requirements?
It's 100% customizable to the specific study. So the keywords can be whatever the user determines. Typically, we start off with like known adverse events and warnings that we gather from the product IFU or technical information. But as far as the outcomes, safety, performance, those it's completely customizable to the specific study. So again, as I mentioned, there's no one size fits all approach to real world data. And within real world data, there's no one size fits all approach to a study. So the ThruWork platform really allows you to tailor it to your individual protocol.
That's great. Thanks, Amelia. And as the answer to your question there around utilizing AI, we hate to use the word AI, right? But it's really just machine learning. So if you have specific keywords, ThreeWare narrows it down based on those keywords using machine learning. Amelia, Michael had a question around and asked, can you list some example international databases you may have access to? Some real world evidence databases are based in the US and have USA patients. And asked around notified bodies and challenges using only US data today. So wondering if you could touch on that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So 3Aware, 3Aware data corpus is not one of the publicly available databases. So we partner directly with health systems and have access to all of their electronic health record data in a de-identified format. But again, as we talked about earlier, there's multiple sources. So, FDA's MAW database, there's many, many national, societal registries that have a lot of data that one can access. So there really is a plethora of data sources for rural data, but 3Aware is unique in that it's directly it is direct electronic health record data versus a third party or other type of data. Same with like a lot of times you might have structured you can work with companies that have access to structured data sets that come from electronic health record data. 3Aware's data also is unique in that it contains both the structured and the unstructured data, as well as, and I think this is quite frankly important for most medical device studies, but you need to be able to know which device was used in the patient. And that may sound obvious, especially now that the incorporation of UDI in devices and device packaging is required. But there is no requirement for hospitals to actually collect that data. So that is not as direct as one might think. So when you're working with a rural data source and you need to have that specific connection, you need to know which device was used in which patient. That would be one of the first questions I would ask with the data provider. I think the second part of that question was considerations for where the data comes from globally and US data to meet EU needs. That again, not a one size fits all approach. So if the device is the same, both in labeling, intended purpose, also on how it is used in clinical practice and in even in what stage of the disease that the product is used and how the procedures occur. If those are the same between where you're collecting the data, for example, in the US, and where you're supporting, what region the data is supporting, let's say in the EU, you have to put together a justification for the use of that data and how the population you're looking at is representative of the location in which you're supporting. However, you need to do that for no matter where you're collecting the data. I would say even within the EU, there's a lot of differences in the way data is collected, in the way, perhaps medical practice occurs within European countries. So having a justification just in general for how your data is representative of the population you're supporting, that should be part of standard practice, regardless.
Thank you, Amelia. That was fantastic. Yeah, and we touched on the new CE mark use case, right, where US data was used for that new CE mark, as well as going to be used for post-market surveillance in Europe as well, used with US data too. I know we ran out of time here, so what we'll do is we'll follow up with everybody and make sure that you have the recording from today. This real world evidence revolution obviously is very big in the med tech space right now, and we're excited to be on the forefront of that. And hopefully you can, uh, you know, attend our next webinar that we'll be having in the new year. And feel free to reach out to us to take a deeper dive into what we have to offer. But thank you so much, Amelia, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.